Chapter 15 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 15. This man was an Asiatic, and a soldier in a colonial regiment. Of a colossal stature, short hair, a nose extremely large, an enormous mouth and dark complexion, he made a most hideous appearance. At first he had placed himself in the middle of the raft, and at each blow of his fist knocked down every one who opposed him. He inspired the greatest terror, and none durst approach him. Had there been 6 such, our destruction would have been certain. Some men, anxious to prolong their existence, armed and united themselves with those who wished to preserve the raft. Among this number were some subaltern officers and many passengers. The rebels drew their sabres, and those who had none armed themselves with knives. They advanced in a determined manner upon us. We stood on our defense. The attack commenced. Animated by despair, one of them aimed a stroke at an officer. The rebel instantly fell, pierced with wounds. This firmness awed them for an instant, but diminished nothing of their rage. They ceased to advance, and withdrew, presenting to us a front bristling with sabres and bayonets, to the back part of the raft to execute their plan. One of them feigned to rest himself on the small railings on the sides of the raft, and with a knife began cutting the cords. Being told by a servant, one of us sprung upon him. A soldier, wishing to defend him, struck at the officer with his knife, which only pierced his coat. The officer wheeled round, seized his adversary, and threw both him and his comrade into the sea. There had been as yet but partial affairs. The combat became general. Someone cried to lower the sail. A crowd of infuriated mortals threw themselves in an instant upon the halyards and the shrouds, and cut them. The fall of the mast almost broke the thigh of a captain of infantry, who fell insensible. He was seized by the soldiers, who threw him into the sea. We saved him, and placed him on a barrel, whence he was taken by the rebels, who wished to put out his eyes with a penknife. Exasperated by so much brutality, we no longer restrained ourselves, but pushed in upon them, and charged them with fury. Sword in hand, we traversed the line which the soldiers had formed, and many paid with their lives the errors of their revolt. Various passengers, during these cruel moments, evinced the greatest courage and coolness. Crawdad fell into a sort of swoon, but hearing at every instant the cries, "To arms! With us, comrades! We are lost!" joined with the groans and imprecations of the wounded and dying, was soon roused from his lethargy. All this horrible tumult speedily made him comprehend how necessary it was to be upon his guard. Armed with his sabre, he gathered together some of his workmen on the front of the raft, and there charged them to hurt no one unless they were attacked. He almost always remained with them, and several times they had to defend themselves against the rebels, who, swimming round to that point of the raft, placed Crawdad and his little troop between 2 dangers, and made their position very difficult to defend. At every instant he was opposed to men armed with knives, sabres, and bayonets. Many had carabines which they wielded as clubs. Every effort was made to stop them by holding them off at the point of their swords, but in spite of the repugnance they experienced in fighting with their wretched countrymen, they were compelled to use their arms without mercy. Many of the mutineers attacked with fury, and they were obliged to repel them in the same manner. Some of the laborers received severe wounds in this action. Their commander could show a great number received in the different engagements. At last their united efforts prevailed in dispersing this mass who had attacked them with such fury. During this combat, Crawdad was told by one of his workmen who remained faithful, that one of their comrades, named Dominique, had gone over to the rebels, and that they had seized and thrown him into the sea. Immediately forgetting the fault and treason of this man, he threw himself in at the place whence the voice of the wretch was heard calling for assistance, seized him by the hair, and had the good fortune to restore him on board. Dominique had got several sabre wounds in a charge, one of which had laid open his head. In spite of the darkness we found out the wound, which seemed very large. One of the workmen gave his handkerchief to bind and stop the blood. Our care recovered the wretch, but, when he had collected strength, the ungrateful Dominique, forgetting at once his duty and the signal service which we had rendered him, went and rejoined the rebels. So much baseness and insanity did not go unrevenged, and soon after he found, in a fresh assault, that death from which he was not worthy to be saved, but which he might in all probability have avoided if, true to honor and gratitude, he had remained among us. Just at the moment we finished dressing the wounds of Dominique, another voice was heard. It was that of the unfortunate female who was with us on the raft, and whom the infuriated beings had thrown into the sea, as well as her husband, who had defended her with courage. M. Correard, in despair at seeing two unfortunates perish, whose pitiful cries, especially the woman's, pierced his heart, seized a large rope which he found on the front of the raft, which he fastened round his middle, and throwing himself a second time into the sea, was again so fortunate as to save the woman, who invoked with all her might the assistance of Our Lady of Land. Her husband was rescued at the same time by the head workman Lavillet. We laid these unfortunate upon the dead bodies, supporting their backs with a barrel. In a short while they recovered their senses. The first thing the woman did was to acquaint herself with the name of the person who saved her, and to express to him her liveliest gratitude. Finding, doubtless, that her words but ill expressed her feelings, she recollected she had in her pocket a little snuff, and instantly offered it to him. It was all she possessed. Touched with the gift, but unable to use it, M. Correard gave it to a poor sailor, which served him for 3 or 4 days. But it is impossible for us to describe a still more affecting scene, the joy this unfortunate couple testified when they had sufficiently recovered their senses at finding that they were both saved. The rebels being repulsed, as it had been stated above, left us a little repose. The moon lighted with her melancholy rays this disastrous raft, this narrow space, on which were found united so many torturing anxieties, so many cruel misfortunes, a madness so insensate, a courage so heroic, and the most generous, the most amiable sentiments of nature and humanity. The man and wife, who had been but a little before stabbed with swords and bayonets, and thrown both together into a stormy sea, could scarcely credit their senses when they found themselves in one another's arms. The woman was a native of the Upper Alps, which place she had left 24 years before, and during which time she had followed the French armies in the campaigns in Italy and other places as a sutler. "Therefore preserve my life," said she to M. Correard. "You see I am a useful woman. Ah, if you knew how often I have ventured upon the field of battle, and braved death to carry assistance to our gallant men. Whether they had money or not, I always let them have my goods. Sometimes a battle would deprive me of my poor debtors, but after the victory others would pay me double or triple for what they had consumed before the engagement. Thus I came in for a share of their victories. Unfortunate woman, she little knew what a horrible fate awaited her among us. They felt, they expressed so vividly that happiness which they alas so shortly enjoyed, that would have drawn tears from the most obdurate heart. But in that horrible moment, when we scarcely breathed from the most furious attack, when we were obliged to be continually on our guard, not only against the violence of the men, but a most boisterous sea, few among us had time to attend to scenes of conjugal affection. After this second check, the rage of the soldiers was suddenly appeased, and gave place to the most abject cowardice. Several threw themselves at our feet, and implored our pardon, which was instantly granted. Thinking that order was re-established, we returned to our station on the center of the raft, only taking the precaution of keeping our arms. We, however, had soon to prove the impossibility of counting on the permanence of any honest sentiment in the hearts of these beings. It was nearly midnight, and after an hour of apparent tranquillity, the soldiers rose afresh. Their mind was entirely gone. They ran upon us in despair with knives and sabres in their hands. As they yet had all their physical strength, and besides were armed, we were obliged again to stand on our defense. Their revolt became still more dangerous, as in their delirium they were entirely deaf to the voice of reason. They attacked us. We charged them in our turn, and immediately the raft was strewed with their dead bodies. Those of our adversaries who had no weapons endeavored to tear us with their sharp teeth. Many of us were cruelly bitten. M. Savigny was torn on the legs and the shoulder. He also received a wound on the right arm, which deprived him the use of his fourth and little finger for a long while. Many others were wounded, and many cuts were found in our clothes from knives and sabers. One of our workmen was also seized by 4 of the rebels, who wished to throw him into the sea. One of them had laid hold of his right leg, and had bit most unmercifully the tendon above the heel. Others were striking him with great slashes of their sabers and with the butt of their guns, when his cries made us hasten to his assistance. In this affair, the brave Lavallee, ex-sergeant of the foot artillery of the Old Guard, behaved with a courage worthy of the greatest praise. He rushed upon the infuriated beings in the manner of M. Correard, and soon snatched the workman from the danger which menaced him. Some short while after, in a fresh attack of the rebels, Sub-Lieutenant Lozache fell into their hands. In their delirium they had taken him for Lieutenant Danglas, of whom we had formerly spoken, and who had abandoned the raft at the moment when we were quitting the frigate. The troop, to a man, eagerly sought this officer, who had seen little service, and whom they reproached for having used them ill during the time they garrisoned the Isle of Ré. We believed this officer lost, but hearing his voice, we soon found it still possible to save him. Immediately Messrs. Claret, Savigny, L'Heureux, Lavallee, Codin, Correard, and some workmen, formed themselves into small platoons, and rushed upon the insurgents with great impetuosity, overturning every one in their way, and retook M. Lozache and placed him on the center of the raft. The preservation of this officer cost us infinite difficulty. Every moment the soldiers demanded he should be delivered to them, designating him always by the name of Danglas. We endeavored to make them comprehend their mistake, and told them that they themselves had seen the person for whom they sought return on board the frigate. They were insensible to everything we said. Everything before them was Danglas. They saw him perpetually, and furiously and unceasingly demanded his head. It was only by force of arms we succeeded in repressing their rage and quieting their dreadful cries of death. Horrible night! Thou shrouded with thy gloomy veil these frightful combats, over which presided the cruel demon of despair. We had also to tremble for the life of M. Codin. Wounded and fatigued by the attacks which he had sustained with us, and in which he had shown a courage superior to everything, he was resting himself on a barrel, holding in his arms a young sailor boy of 12 years of age, to whom he had attached himself. The mutineers seized him with his barrel, and threw him into the sea with the boy, whom he still held fast. In spite of his burden, he had the presence of mind to lay hold of the raft, and to save himself from this extreme peril. We cannot yet comprehend how a handful of men should have been able to resist such a number so monstrously insane. We are sure we were not more than 20 to combat all these madmen. Let it not, however, be imagined that in the midst of all these dangers we had preserved our reason entire. Fear, anxiety, and the most cruel privations had greatly changed our intellectual faculties. But being somewhat less insane than the unfortunate soldiers, we energetically opposed their determination of cutting the cords of the raft. Permit us now to make some observations concerning the different sensations with which we were affected. During the first day, M. Griffin entirely lost his senses. He threw himself into the sea, but M. Savigny saved him with his own hands. His words were vague and unconnected. A second time he threw himself in, but, by a sort of instinct, kept hold of the cross pieces of the raft, and was again saved. The following is what M. Savigny experienced in the beginning of the night. His eyes closed in spite of himself, and he felt a general drowsiness. In this condition the most delightful visions flitted across his imagination. He saw around him a country covered with the most beautiful plantations, and found himself in the midst of objects delightful to his senses. Nevertheless, he reasoned concerning his condition, and felt that courage alone could withdraw him from this species of non-existence. He demanded some wine from the master gunner, who got it for him, and he recovered a little from this stupor. If the unfortunates who were assailed with these primary symptoms had not strength to withstand them, their death was certain. Some became furious, Others threw themselves into the sea, bidding farewell to their comrades with the utmost coolness. Some said, "Fear nothing, I am going to get you assistance, and will return in a short while." In the midst of this general madness, some wretches were seen rushing upon their companions, sword in hand, demanding a wing of a chicken and some bread to appease the hunger which consumed them. Others asked for their hammocks to go, they said, between the decks of the frigate to take a little repose. Many believed they were still on the Medusa, surrounded by the same objects they there saw daily. Some saw ships, and called to them for assistance, or a fine harbor in the distance of which was an elegant city. Crawdad thought he was travelling through the beautiful fields of Italy. An officer said to him, "I recollect we have been abandoned by the boats, but fear nothing, I am going to write to the governor, and in a few hours we shall be saved." Crawdad replied in the same tone, as if he had been in his ordinary condition, "Have you a pigeon to carry your orders with such celerity?" The cries and the confusion soon roused us from this languor, but when tranquillity was somewhat restored, we again fell into the same drowsy condition. On the morrow we felt as if we had awoke from a painful dream, and asked our companions if during their sleep they had not seen combats and heard cries of despair. Some replied that the same visions had continually tormented them, and that they were exhausted with fatigue. Everyone believed he was deceived by the illusions of a horrible dream. After these different combats, overcome with toil, with want of food and sleep, we laid ourselves down and reposed till the morrow dawned, and showed us the horror of the scene. A great number in their delirium had thrown themselves into the sea. We found that 60 or 65 had perished during the night. A fourth part at least, we supposed, had drowned themselves in despair. We only lost 2 of our own numbers, neither of whom were officers. The deepest dejection was painted on every face. Each, having recovered himself, could now feel the horrors of his situation, and some of us, shedding tears of despair, bitterly deplored the rigor of our fate. A new misfortune was now revealed to us. During the tumult, the rebels had thrown into the sea 2 barrels of wine, and the only 2 casks of water which we had upon the raft. 2 casks of wine had been consumed the day before, and only 1 was left. We were more than 60 in number, and we were obliged to put ourselves on half rations. At the break of day, the sea calmed, which permitted us again to erect our mast. When it was replaced, we made a distribution of wine. The unhappy soldiers murmured and blamed us for privations which we equally endured with them. They fell exhausted. We had taken nothing for 48 hours, and we had been obliged to struggle continually against a strong sea. We could, like them, hardly support ourselves. Courage alone made us still act. We resolved to employ every possible means to catch fish, and, collecting all the hooks and eyes from the soldiers, made fish hooks of them, but all was of no avail. The currents carried our lines under the raft, where they got entangled. We bent a bayonet to catch sharks. One bit at it, and straightened it, and we abandoned our project. Something was absolutely necessary to sustain our miserable existence, and we tremble with horror at being obliged to tell that of which we made use. We feel our pen fall from our hands, a mortal cold congeals all our members, and our hair bristles erect on our foreheads. Readers, we implore you, feel not indignant towards men already overloaded with misery. Pity their condition, and shed a tear of sorrow for their deplorable fate. The wretches, whom death had spared during the disastrous night we have described, seized upon the dead bodies with which the raft was covered, cutting them up by slices, which some even instantly devoured. Many nevertheless refrained. Almost all the officers were of this number. Seeing that this monstrous food had revived the strength of those who had used it, it was proposed to dry it to make it a little more palatable. Those who had firmness to abstain from it took an additional quantity of wine. We endeavored to eat shoulder belts and cartouche boxes, and contrived to swallow some small bits of them. Some eat linen, others the leathers of their hats, on which was a little grease, or rather dirt. We had recourse to many expedients to prolong our miserable existence, to recount which would only disgust the heart of humanity. The day was calm and beautiful. A ray of hope beamed for a moment to quiet our agitation. We still expected to see the boats or some ships, and addressed our prayers to the Eternal, on whom we placed our trust. The half of our men were extremely feeble, and bore upon their faces the stamp of approaching dissolution. The evening arrived, and we found no help. The darkness of the third night augmented our fears, but the wind was still and the sea less agitated. The sun of the fourth morning since our departure shone upon our disaster, and showed us 10 or 12 of our companions stretched lifeless upon the raft. This sight struck us most forcibly, as it told us we would be soon extended in the same manner in the same place. We gave their bodies to the sea for a grave, reserving only one to feed those who, but the day before, had held his trembling hands, and sworn to him eternal friendship. This day was beautiful. Our souls, anxious for more delightful sensations, were in harmony with the aspect of the heavens, and got again a new ray of hope. Towards 4 in the afternoon, an unlooked for event happened which gave us some consolation. A shoal of flying fish passed under our raft, and as there were an infinite number of openings between the pieces which composed it, the fish were entangled in great quantities. We threw ourselves upon them, and captured a considerable number. We took about 200 and put them in an empty barrel. We opened them as we caught them, and took out what is called their milt. This food seemed delicious, but one man would have required 1,000. Our first emotion was to give to God renewed thanks for this unhoped for favor. An ounce of gunpowder having been found in the morning, was dried in the sun during the day, which was very fine. A steel, gunflints, and tinder made also a part of the same parcel. After a good deal of difficulty, we set fire to some fragments of dry linen. We made a large opening in the side of an empty cask, and placed at the bottom of it several wet things. Upon this kind of scaffolding we set our fire, all of which we placed on a barrel that the sea water might not extinguish it. We cooked some fish, and eat them with extreme avidity, but our hunger was such, and our portion so small, that we added to it some of the sacrilegious viands, which with the cooking rendered less revolting. This some of the officers touched for the first time. From this day we continued to eat it, but we could no longer dress it, the means of making a fire having been entirely lost. The barrel having caught fire, we extinguished it without being able to preserve anything to rekindle it on the morrow. The powder and tinder were entirely gone. This meal gave us all additional strength to support our fatigues. The night was tolerable, and would have been happy, had it not been signalized by a new massacre. Some Spaniards, Italians, and negroes had formed a plot to throw us all into the sea. The negroes had told them that they were very near the shore, and that, when there, they would enable them to traverse Africa without danger. We had to take our arms again, the sailors, who had remained faithful to us, pointing out to us the conspirators. The first signal for battle was given by a Spaniard, who, placing himself behind the mast, holding fast by it, made the sign of the cross with one hand, invoking the name of God, and with the other held a knife. The sailors seized him and threw him into the sea. An Italian, servant to an officer of the troops, who was in the plot, seeing all was discovered, armed himself with the only boarding axe left on the raft, made his retreat to the front, enveloped himself in a piece of drapery he wore across his breast, and of his own accord threw himself into the sea. The rebels rushed forward to avenge their comrades. A terrible conflict again commenced. Both sides fought with desperate fury, and soon the fatal raft was strewed with dead bodies and blood, which should have been shed by other hands, and in another cause. In this tumult we heard them again demanding, with horrid rage, the head of Lieutenant Danglas. In this assault the unfortunate sutler was a second time thrown into the sea. M. Coudin, assisted by some workmen, saved her, to prolong for a little while her torment and her existence. In this terrible night Lavilette failed not to give proofs of the rarest intrepidity. It was to him, and some of those who had survived the sequel of our misfortunes, that we owed our safety. At last, after unheard of efforts, the rebels were once more repulsed and quiet restored. Having escaped this new danger, we endeavored to get some repose. The day at length dawned upon us for the 5th time. We were now no more than 30 in number. We had lost 4 or 5 of our faithful sailors, and those who survived were in the most deplorable condition. The sea water had almost entirely excoriated the skin of our lower extremities. We were covered with contusions or wounds, which, irritated by the salt water, extorted from us the most piercing cries. About 20 of us only were capable of standing upright or walking. Almost all our fish were exhausted. We had but 4 days' supply of wine. In 4 days, said we, nothing will be left, and death will be inevitable. Thus came the 7th day of our abandonment. In the course of the day 2 soldiers had glided behind the only barrel of wine that was left, pierced it, and were drinking by means of a reed. We had sworn that those who used such means should be punished with death, which law was instantly put in execution, and the 2 transgressors were thrown into the sea. This day saw the close of the life of a child named Leon, aged 12 years. He died like a lamp which ceases to burn for want of aliment. All spoke in favor of this young and amiable creature, who merited a better fate. His angelic form, his musical voice, the interest of an age so tender increased still more by the courage he had shown, and the services he had performed, for he had already made in the preceding year a campaign in the East Indies, inspired us all with the greatest pity for this young victim, devoted to so horrible and premature a death. Our old soldiers, and all our people in general, did everything they could to prolong his existence, but all was in vain. Neither the wine which they gave him without regret, nor all the means they employed could arrest his melancholy doom, and he expired in the arms of M. Coudin, who had not ceased to give him the most unwearied attention. Whilst he had strength to move, he ran incessantly from one side to the other, loudly calling for his unhappy mother, for water and food. He trod indiscriminately on the feet and legs of his companions in misfortune, who, in their turn, uttered sorrowful cries, but these were very rarely accompanied with menaces. They pardoned all which the poor boy had made them suffer. He was not in his senses, consequently could not be expected to behave as if he had had the use of his reason. There now remained but 27 of us. 15 of that number seemed able to live yet some days; the rest, covered with large wounds, had almost entirely lost the use of their reason. They still, however, shared in the distributions, and would, before they died, consume to 30 or 40 bottles of wine, which to us were inestimable. We deliberated, that by putting the sick on half allowance was but putting them to death by halves; but after a council, at which presided the most dreadful despair, it was decided they should be thrown into the sea. This means, however repugnant, however horrible it appeared to us, procured the survivors 6 days' wine. But after the decision was made, who durst execute it? The habit of seeing death ready to devour us, the certainty of our infallible destruction without this monstrous expedient, all, in short, had hardened our hearts to every feeling but that of self-preservation. 3 sailors and a soldier took charge of this cruel business. We looked aside and shed tears of blood at the fate of these unfortunates. Among them were the wretched sutler and her husband. Both had been grievously wounded in the different combats. The woman had a thigh broken between the beams of the raft, and a stroke of the saber had made a deep wound in the head of her husband. Everything announced their approaching end. We consoled ourselves with the belief that our cruel resolution shortened but a brief space the term of their existence. Ye who shudder at the cry of outraged humanity, recollect, that it was other men, fellow countrymen, comrades, who had placed us in this awful situation. This horrible expedient saved the 15 who remained, for when we were found by the Argus brig we had very little wine left, and it was the 6th day after the cruel sacrifice we have described. The victims, we repeat, had not more than 48 hours to live, and by keeping them on the raft, we would have been absolutely destitute of the means of existence 2 days before we were found. Weak as we were, we considered it as a certain thing that it would have been impossible for us to have lived only 24 hours more without taking some food. After this catastrophe we threw our arms into the sea. They inspired us with a horror we could not overcome. We only kept one saber, in case we had to cut some cordage or some piece of wood. A new event, for everything was an event to wretches to whom the world was reduced to the narrow space of a few toises, and for whom the winds and waves contended in their fury as they floated above the abyss. An event happened which diverted our minds from the horrors of our situation. All on a sudden a white butterfly, of a species common in France, came fluttering above our heads, and settled on our sails. The first thought this little creature suggested was, that it was a harbinger of approaching land, and we clung to the hope with a delirium of joy. It was the 9th day we had been upon the raft. The torments of hunger consumed our entrails, and the soldiers and sailors already devoured with haggard eyes this wretched prey, and seemed ready to dispute about it. Others, looking upon it as a messenger from heaven, declared that they took it under their protection, and would suffer none to do it harm. It is certain we could not be far from land, for the butterflies continued to come on the following days, and flutter about our sail. We had also on the same day another indication not less positive, by a gulland which floated around our raft. This second visitor left us no doubt that we were fast approaching the African soil, and we persuaded ourselves we would be speedily thrown upon the coast by the force of the currents. This same day a new care employed us. Seeing we were reduced to so small a number, we collected all the little strength we had left, detached some planks on the front of the raft, and with some pretty long pieces of wood, raised on the center a kind of platform, on which we reposed. All the effects we could collect were placed upon it, and rendered to make it less hard, which also prevented the sea from passing with such facility through the spaces between the different planks, but the waves came across, and sometimes covered us completely. On this new theater we resolved to meet death in a manner becoming Frenchmen, and with perfect resignation. Our time was almost wholly spent in speaking of our unhappy country. All our wishes, our last prayers, were for the prosperity of France. Thus passed the last days of our abode upon the raft. Soon after our abandonment, we bore with comparative ease the immersions during the night, which are very cold in these countries, but latterly, every time the waves washed over us, we felt a most painful sensation, and we uttered plaintive cries. We employed every means to avoid it. Some supported their heads on pieces of wood, and made with what they could find a sort of little parapet to screen them from the force of the waves. Others sheltered themselves behind 2 empty casks. But these means were very insufficient. It was only when the sea was calm that it did not break over us. An ardent thirst, redoubled in the day by the beams of a burning sun, consumed us. An officer of the army found by chance a small lemon, and it may be easily imagined how valuable such a fruit would be to him. His comrades, in spite of the most urgent entreaties, could not get a bit of it from him. Signs of rage were already manifested, and he had not partly listened to the solicitations of those around him, they would have taken it by force, and he would have perished the victim of his selfishness. We also disputed about 30 cloves of garlic, which were found in the bottom of a sack. These disputes were for the most part accompanied with violent menaces, and if they had been prolonged, we might perhaps have come to the last extremities. There was found also 2 small phials, in which was found a spirituous liquid for cleaning the teeth. He who possessed them kept them with care, and gave with reluctance 1 or 2 drops in the palm of the hand. This liquor, which, we think, was a tincture of guaiacum, cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatic substances, produced on our tongues an agreeable feeling, and for a short while removed the thirst which destroyed us. Some of us found small pieces of powder, which made, when put into the mouth, a kind of coolness. One plan generally employed was to put into a hat a quantity of sea water, with which we washed our faces for a while, repeating it at intervals. We also bathed our hair and held our hands in the water. Misfortune made us ingenious, and each thought of 1,000 means to alleviate his sufferings. Emaciated by the most cruel privations, the least agreeable feeling was to us a happiness supreme. Thus we sought with avidity a small empty phial which one of us possessed, and in which had once been some essence of roses, and every one as he got hold of it respired with delight the odor it exhaled, which imparted to his senses the most soothing impressions. Many of us kept our ration of wine in a small tin cup, and sucked it out with a quill. This manner of taking it was of great benefit to us, and allayed our thirst much better than if we had gulped it off at once. 3 days passed in inexpressible anguish. So much did we despise life, that many of us feared not to bathe in the sight of the sharks which surrounded our raft. Others placed themselves naked upon the front of our machine, which was under water. These expedients diminished a little ardor of their thirst. A species of mollusca, known to seamen by the name of gatier, was sometimes driven in great numbers on our raft, and when their long arms rested on our naked bodies, they occasioned us the most cruel sufferings. Will it be believed that amidst these terrible scenes, struggling with inevitable death, some of us uttered pleasantries, which made us yet smile, in spite of the horrors of our situation? One besides others said jestingly, "If the brig is sent to search us, pray God it has the eyes of Argus," in allusion to the name of the vessel we presumed would be sent to our assistance. This consolatory idea never left us an instant, and we spoke of it frequently. On the 16th, reckoning we were very near land, 8 of the most determined among us resolved to endeavor to gain the coast. A second raft, of smaller dimensions, was formed for transporting them thither, but it was found insufficient, and they at length determined to await death in their present situation. Meanwhile night came on, and its somber veil revived in our minds the most afflicting thoughts. We were convinced there were not above a dozen or 15 bottles of wine in our barrel. We began to have an invincible disgust at the flesh which had till then scarcely supported us, and we may say that the sight of it inspired us with feelings of horror, doubtless produced by the idea of our approaching destruction. On the morning of the 17th the sun appeared free from clouds. After having addressed our prayers to the Eternal, we divided among us a part of our wine. Each with delight was taking his small portion, when a captain of infantry, casting his eyes on the horizon, perceived a ship, announced it to us by an exclamation of joy. We knew it to be a brig, but it was at a great distance, we could distinguish the masts. The sight of this vessel revived in us emotions difficult to describe. Each believed his deliverance sure, and we gave 1,000 thanks to God. Fears, however, mingled with our hopes. We straightened some hoops of casks, to the ends of which we fixed handkerchiefs of different colors. A man, with our united assistance, mounted to the top of the mast, and waved these little flags. For more than half an hour we were tossed between hope and fear. Some thought the vessel grew larger, and others were convinced its course was from us. These last were the only ones whose eyes were not blinded by hope, for the ship disappeared. From the delirium of joy we passed to that of despondency and sorrow. We envied the fate of those whom we had seen perish at our sides, and we said to ourselves, when we shall be in want of everything, and when our strength begins to forsake us, we will wrap ourselves up as well as we can, we will stretch ourselves on this platform, the witness of the most cruel sufferings, and there await death with resignation. At length, to calm our despair, we sought for consolation in the arm of sleep. The day before, we had been scorched by the beams of a burning sun. Today, to avoid the fierceness of his rays, we made a tent with the mainsail of the frigate. As soon as it was finished, we laid ourselves under it. Thus all that was passing without was hid from our eyes. We proposed then to write upon a plank an abridgment of our adventures, and to add our names at the bottom of the recital, and fix it to the upper part of the mast, in the hope it would reach the government and our families. After having passed 2 hours, a prey to the most cruel reflections, the master gunner of the frigate, wishing to go to the front of the raft, went out from below the tent. Scarcely had he put out his head when he turned to us, uttering a piercing cry. Joy was painted on his face. His hands were stretched towards the sea. He breathed with difficulty. All he was able to say was, "Saved! See the brig upon us!" And in fact it was not more than half a league distant, having every sail set, and steering right upon us. We rushed from our tent, even those whom enormous wounds in their inferior extremities had confined for many days, dragged themselves to the back of the raft, to enjoy a sight of the ship which had come to save us from certain death. We embraced one another with a transport which looked much like madness, and tears of joy trickled down our cheeks, withered by the most cruel privations. Each seized handkerchiefs or some pieces of linen to make signals to the brig, which was rapidly approaching us. Some fell on their knees, and fervently returned thanks to Providence for this miraculous preservation of our lives. Our joy redoubled when we saw at the top of the foremast a large white flag, and we cried, "It is then to Frenchmen we will owe our deliverance." We instantly recognized the brig to be the Argus. It was then about 2 gunshots from us. We were terribly impatient to see her reef her sails, which at last she did, and fresh cries of joy arose from our raft. The Argus came and laid to on our starboard, about half a pistol shot from us. The crew, ranged upon the deck and on the shrouds, announced to us, by the waving of their hands and hats, the pleasure they felt at coming to the assistance of their unfortunate countrymen. In a short time we were all transported on board the brig, where we found the lieutenant of the frigate, and some others who had been wrecked with us. Compassion was painted on every face, and pity drew tears from every eye which beheld us. We found some excellent broth on board the brig, which they had prepared, and when they had perceived us, they added to it some wine, and thus restored our nearly exhausted strength. They bestowed on us the most generous care and attention. Our wounds were dressed, and on the morrow many of our sick began to revive. Some, however, still suffered much, for they were placed between decks, very near the kitchen, which augmented the almost insupportable heat of these latitudes. This want of space arose from the small size of the vessel. The number of the shipwrecked was indeed very considerable. Those who did not belong to the navy were laid upon cables, wrapped in flags, and placed under the fire of the kitchen. Here they had almost perished during the course of the night, fire having broken out between decks about 10 in the evening, but timely assistance being rendered, we were saved for the second time. We had scarcely escaped when some of us became again delirious. An officer of infantry wished to throw himself into the sea, to look for his pocket book, and would have done it had he not been prevented. Others were seized in a manner not less frenzied. The commander and officers of the brig watched over us, and kindly anticipated our wants. They snatched us from death, by saving us from our raft. Their unremitting care revived within us the spark of life. The surgeon of the ship, M. Renaud, distinguished himself for his indefatigable zeal. He was obliged to spend the whole of the day in dressing our wounds, and during the 2 days we were in the brig he bestowed on us all the aid of his art, with an attention and gentleness which merit our eternal gratitude. In truth, it was time we should find an end of our sufferings. They had lasted 13 days, in the most cruel manner. The strongest among us might have lived 48 hours or so longer. M. Crawdad felt that he must die in the course of the day. He had, however, a presentiment we would be saved. He said that a series of events so unheard of would not be buried in oblivion, that Providence would at least preserve some of us to tell to the world the melancholy story of our misfortunes. Such is the faithful history of those who were left upon the memorable raft. Of 150, 15 only were saved. 5 of that number never recovered from their fatigue, and died at St. Louis. Those who yet live are covered with scars, and the cruel sufferings to which they have been exposed have materially shaken their constitutions. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16. Of thrilling narratives of mutiny, murder, and piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. The Loss of the Royal George. On the 29th of August, 1782, it was found necessary that the Royal George, a line of battleship of 108 guns, which had lately arrived at Spithead from a cruise, should, previously to her going again to sea, undergo the operation which seamen technically call a parliament heel. In such cases the ship is inclined in a certain degree on one side, while the defects below the water mark on the other side are examined and repaired. This mode of proceeding is, we believe, at the present day, very commonly adopted where the defects to be repaired are not extensive, or where, as was the case with the Royal George, it is desirable to avoid the delay of going into dock. The operation is usually performed in still weather and smooth water, and is attended with so little difficulty and danger that the officers and crew usually remain on board, and neither the guns nor stores are removed. The business was commenced on the Royal George early in the morning, a gang of men from the Portsmouth dockyard coming on board to assist the ship's carpenters. It is said that, finding it necessary to strip off more of the sheathing than had been intended, the men, in their eagerness to reach the defect in the ship's bottom, were induced to heel her too much, when a sudden squall of wind threw her wholly on her side, and the gun ports being opened, and the cannon rolling over to the depressed side, the ship was unable to right herself, instantaneously filled with water, and went to the bottom. The fatal accident happened about 10 o'clock in the morning. Admiral Kempenfeld was writing in his cabin, and the greater part of the people were between decks. The ship, as is usually the case upon coming into port, was crowded with people from the shore, particularly women, of whom it is supposed there were not less than 300 on board. Amongst the sufferers were many of the wives and children of the petty officers and seamen who, knowing the ship was shortly to sail on a distant and perilous service, eagerly embraced the opportunity of visiting their husbands and fathers. The admiral, who, with many brave officers, and most of those who were between decks, perished. The greater number of the guard, and those who happened to be on the upper deck, were saved by the boats of the fleet. About 70 others were likewise saved. The exact number of persons on board at the time could not be ascertained, but it was calculated that from 800 to 1,000 were lost. Captain Waghorn, whose gallantry in the North Sea battle under Admiral Parker had procured him the command of this ship, was saved, though he was severely bruised and battered, but his son, a lieutenant in the Royal George, perished. Such was the force of the whirlpool occasioned by the sudden plunge of so vast a body in the water, that a victualler which lay alongside the Royal George was swamped, and several small craft at a considerable distance were in imminent danger. Admiral Kempenfeld, who was nearly 70 years of age, was peculiarly and universally lamented. In point of general science and judgment, he was one of the first naval officers of his time, and, particularly in the art of manoeuvring a fleet, he was considered by the commanders of that day as unrivaled. His excellent qualities as a man are said to have equaled his professional merits. This melancholy occurrence has been recorded by the poet Cowper in the following beautiful lines: Toll for the brave that are no more, all sunk beneath the wave, fast by their native shore. 800 of the brave, whose courage well was tried, had made the vessel heel, and laid her on her side. A land breeze shook the shrouds, and she was overset. Down went the Royal George, with all her crew complete. Toll for the brave Kempenfeld is gone, his last sea fight is fought, his work of glory done. It was not in the battle, no tempest gave the shock, she sprang no fatal leak, she ran upon no rock. His sword was in his sheath, his fingers held the pen, when Kempenfeld went down with twice 400 men. Weigh the vessel up, once dreaded by our foes, and mingle with our cup the tear that England owes. Her timbers yet are sound, and she may float again, full charged with England's thunder, and plough the distant main. But Kempenfeld is gone, his victories are over, and he and his 800 shall plough the wave no more. End of The Loss of the Royal George. Chapter 17 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 17. Loss of the Aeneas Transport. The Aeneas transport sailed with 347 souls on board, including a party of men belonging to the 100th Regiment of Foot, also some officers, together with several women and children. About 4 in the morning of the 23rd of October, 1805, the vessel struck violently on a rock, and received such damage that her total wreck soon became evident to all on board. For the first few minutes of this alarming occurrence, the women and children clung to their husbands and fathers, but in a short time a prodigious wave swept not less than 250 of those miserable people into the ocean. The rock whereon the vessel had struck speedily forced its way through the decks, and then it appears, from her parting, 35 of the survivors were driven on a small island before 8 in the morning, about a quarter of a mile distant, but when she had entirely gone to pieces. The narrative of these events was collected from one of the survivors, a soldier of the 100th Regiment, who could give no correct account of how he and the others got ashore, but he supposed they were floated in by part of the wreck. He remembered to have observed one of the boys endeavoring to save Major Bertram, whose arm was broken by some timber, and he was on the point of sinking. He held him up as long as his strength permitted, but to save his own life was forced to let go his hold, and the Major perished. The 35 men who gained the shore consisted of part of the regiment, 2 of whom were officers, Lieutenant Dawson and Ensign Faulkner, and 7 sailors. Immediately on landing, the wind unfortunately changed, so that not an article of any kind was saved from the wreck. Mr. Faulkner was aware of the real situation they had reached, judging the mainland, which they saw about a mile distant, to be Newfoundland, and that they were about 300 miles distant from the town of St. John's. After passing one night on the little island, they constructed a raft, by means of which 30 of them arrived on the mainland. Previous to this, however, 4 survivors of the shipwreck had died, among whom was the poor fellow who had endeavored to save Major Bertram. Another, who had both his legs broken, was missing, and he crawled away from his comrades that he might die in quiet. But 8 days afterwards he was found alive, though in a shocking state, as his feet were frozen off. Yet he survived all this, and reached Quebec at a future period. Most of the party set out, leaving 3 behind them who were unable to walk from bruises, and directed their course toward the rising sun. But when the first day had elapsed, Lieutenant Dawson became incapable of keeping up with the remainder, and 2 soldiers stayed to attend him. These 3 toiled onwards without any food, except the berries which they found, and Lieutenant Dawson was then unable to stand unless supported. On reaching the banks of a river, one of the soldiers attempted to carry him across on his back, but having waded up to the neck, he was obliged to return and lay him down on the bank. There Mr. Dawson entreated his faithful attendants to make the best of their way, and leave him to his fate, and at the same time affectionately squeezed their hands, he entreated them to inform his father of his melancholy end. Here the soldier, who was one of them, and who related these affecting incidents, burst into a flood of tears before he could proceed. "We stayed with him," he said, "until we did not know whether he was alive or dead." The two survivors continued wandering in a weak and feeble state for 12 days longer, making 26 days in all from the period of their shipwreck, and subsisting on what they could find on a barren and inhospitable land. But after the first 4 or 5 days they suffered no hunger, for, as they themselves said, their misfortunes were so great as to banish its influence and to deprive them of the sense of feeling. The snow, besides, was so deep during the last 2 days as to prevent them from getting the berries as usual. At last they were found by a man belonging to a hunting party, who, little suspecting to see human beings in that desolate region, took them at a distance for deer, and had concealed himself behind a fallen tree with his gun pointed towards one of them, when his dog, leaping towards them, began to bark, and shewed his error. When they related their shipwreck and the sufferings they had endured, tears stole down the cheeks of the huntsman, and taking the moccasins from his feet, gave them to the poor miserable creatures. He invited them to his hunting cabin, saying it was only a mile off, though the real distance was at least 12 miles. But by degrees he enticed them to proceed, and at length they gained it. On approaching the hut, 4 or 5 men came out with long bloody knives in their hands, when the narrator, turning to his comrade, exclaimed, "After all we have escaped, are we brought here to be butchered and ate up?" But they soon discovered their mistake, for the men had been cutting up some deer, the fruit of their chase, and the appearance of the unfortunate soldiers quickly exciting sentiments of pity in their breast. They produced a bottle of rum, wherewith they were refreshed. Every possible comfort was ministered by the hunters to the unfortunate wanderers, and from the accounts and descriptions given to them, they set out in quest of others. They luckily succeeded in finding the man who remained the first day on the island, and also the other 2 who were unable to leave the shore. The 2 men who had accompanied Lieutenant Dawson appeared to have made but little progress during 26 days of traveling, for they were discovered in a place not very remote from whence they set out. Thus involved among the woods, they must have returned over the same ground that they had passed. Those who the huntsman first met endeavored to make them understand where they might find the remains of Lieutenant Dawson and Ensign Faulkner and his party, but they could speak so vaguely, and where they had themselves been, to give any pointed directions on the subject. But 2 of the latter were found by a man on another hunting excursion about 90 miles distant, apparently lifeless, though on being carried to an adjacent settlement they recovered. Of the whole 35 who survived the wreck of the transport, accounts could be heard only of these 5. Ensign Faulkner was a strong, active, enterprising man, and fully capable of adopting whatever means could be devised for preservation. He and Lieutenant Dawson, who was scarce more than 17 years of age, were of the greatest promise. While the transport lay about 3 miles from Portsmouth, they are said to have swam to the ship, when the former climbed up her side, but the latter was nearly exhausted. A brig from port, which touched at Newfoundland, carried 5 of the survivors from thence to Quebec, and when they arrived there in the barrack square, a most affecting scene ensued. Men and women eagerly flocked around them, with anxious inquiries for some friend or brother who was on board the ill-fated vessel. But all they could answer was, "If you do not see him here, be assured he has perished. For of 347 souls, we 5 Irish lads and 2 sailors are all that remain alive." The tears and exclamations following these words can scarce be described. End of chapter 17. Loss of the Aeneas transport. Chapter 18 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 18. The Absent Ship. Fair ship, I saw thee bounding o'er the deep, thy white wings glancing in the morning ray, and many a sparkling eye in vain did weep for the bold hearts that steered thee on thy way. Long days of grief have lingered into years. Return, return, and charm away those tears. I listened till the music and the song died on the waters as she swept along. I watched her stately beauty till it grew a fading shadow on the distant blue. Less and still less, the waters are alone. Queen of the ocean, whither art thou gone? A wintry storm hath sighed itself to sleep, yet still thou lingerest on the faithless deep. Have calmer seas and skies of deeper blue charmed thee to bid thine island home adieu? Long has yon dark-eyed maiden wept in vain. Return, return, and bid her smile again. Long mayst thou weep, but never shalt thou see thy fair-haired mariner return to thee. Clasp thy young beauty in a long embrace, and read his pardon in thy happy face. Thy gentle prayers, fair mourner, could not save. Thy sailor sleeps within the stormy wave. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 19. Loss of the Halswell. The catastrophe which is now about to be related made a deep impression on the public mind. The circumstances attending it were too aggravating not to excite the highest degree of commiseration, whether from the flattering prospects held forth in the outset of the voyage, or from a peculiar feeling towards the condition of the sufferers. The Halswell East Indiaman, of 758 tons burthen, commanded by Captain Richard Pierce, was taken up by the directors of the East India Company to make her 3rd voyage to coast and bay. On the 16th of November, 1785, she fell down to Gravesend, where she completed her lading. Ladies and other passengers being taken on board at the Hope, she hailed through the Downs on Sunday, the 1st of January, 1786. And when abreast of Dunnos next morning, the weather fell calm. This was one of the finest ships in the service, and judged to be in the most perfect condition for her voyage. Her commander was of distinguished ability and exemplary character, his officers of approved fidelity and unquestionable knowledge in their profession, and the crew not only as numerous as the East India establishment admits, but the best seamen that could be collected. To these were added a considerable body of soldiers, destined to recruit the forces of the East India Company in Asia. The passengers were 7 ladies, 2 of whom were daughters to the captain, and other 2 his relations. Miss Elizabeth Blackburn, daughter of Captain Blackburn, Miss Mary Haggard, sister to an officer on the Madras establishment, and Miss Anne Mansell, a child of European parents residing in Madras, returning from her education in England. There was also Mr. John George Schultz, returning to collect part of his fortune which he had left behind him in India. The ladies were equally distinguished by their beauty and accomplishments, the gentlemen of amiable manners, and of a highly respectable character. Mr. Burston, the chief mate, was also related to Captain Pierce's lady, and the whole formed a happy society united in friendship. Nothing could be more pleasing or encouraging than the outset of the voyage. On Monday, the 2nd of January, a breeze from the south sprung up at 3 in the afternoon, when the ship ran in shore to land the pilot. Very thick weather coming in on the evening, and the wind baffling, she was obliged to anchor, at 9 o'clock, in 18-fathom water. The topsails were furled, but the people could not furl the courses, the snow falling thick and freezing as it fell. The next morning at 4 a strong gale came on from east-northeast, and the ship shivering, they were obliged to cut the cables and run out to sea. At noon they spoke with a brig bound to Dublin, and, having put the pilot on board of her, immediately bore down the channel. The wind freshening at 8 in the evening, and coming round to the southward, such sails were reefed as were judged necessary. It blew a violent gale at 10 o'clock from the south, whence they were obliged to carry a press of sail to keep the ship off shore. In doing this, the hawse plugs, which, according to a late improvement, were put inside, were washed in, and the hawse bags washed away, in consequence of which the vessel shipped a large quantity of water on the gun deck. On sounding the well, and finding the ship had sprung a leak, and now had 5 feet water in the hold, the people clewed up the main topsail, hauled up the mainsail, and immediately endeavored to furl both, but could not effect it. On discovering the leak, all the pumps were set to work. At 2 in the morning of Wednesday the 4th, they tried to wear the ship, but without success, and judging it necessary to cut away the mizzenmast, this was immediately done, when another attempt made to wear her was equally fruitless as the former. The ship had now 7 feet water in the hold, which was gaining fast on the pumps. Therefore, for her preservation it was considered expedient to cut away the mainmast, as she appeared to be in immediate danger of foundering. In the fall of the mast, Jonathan Morton, coxswain, and 4 men, were either drawn along with the wreck or fell overboard and were drowned. By 8 in the morning the wreck was cleared, and the ship got before the wind, in which position she was kept 2 hours. Meantime the pumps reduced the water in the hold 2 feet, and the ship's head was brought to the eastward with the foresail only. At 10 in the morning the wind abated considerably, but the ship laboring extremely, rolled the fore topmast over on the larboard side, and, in the fall, the wreck went through the foresail, tearing it to pieces. At 11 the wind came to the westward, and the weather clearing up, the Berryhead was distinguishable, bearing north and by east, distant 4 or 5 leagues. Another foresail was now immediately bent, a jury mainmast erected, and a top gallant sail set for a mainsail, under which sail Captain Pierce bore up for Portsmouth, and employed the remainder of the day in getting up a jury mizzenmast. At 2 the next morning the wind came to the southward, blowing fresh, the weather being very thick. Portland was seen at noon, bearing north and by east, distant 2 or 3 leagues. At night it blew a strong gale at south, at which time the Portland lights were then seen, bearing northwest, distant 4 or 5 leagues. The ship was then wore, and her head got round to the westward, but finding she lost ground on that tack, the captain wore her again, and kept stretching on to the eastward, in hopes to have weathered Peveril Point, in which case he intended to have anchored in Studland Bay. It cleared at 11 at night, and St. Albans Head was seen 1.5 miles to leeward, on which sail was instantly taken in, and the small bower anchor let go, which brought up the ship at a whole cable. She rode for about an hour, but then drove. The sheet anchor was now let go, and a whole cable wore away, and the ship rode for about 2 hours longer, when she drove again. While in this situation the captain sent for Mr. Henry Meryton, the second mate, and asked his opinion as to the probability of saving the lives of those on board, to which he replied with equal calmness and candor, that he apprehended there was very little hope of it, as the ship was driving fast on shore, and might every moment be expected to strike. The boats were then mentioned, but it was agreed, that although at that time they could be of very little use, yet in case an opportunity of making them serviceable should present itself, it was proposed that the officers should be confidentially requested to reserve the longboat for the ladies and themselves, and this precaution was immediately taken. About 2 in the morning of Friday the 6th of January, the ship still driving, and approaching very fast to the shore, the same officer went again into the cuddy, where the captain then was. Another conversation taking place, Captain Pierce expressed extreme anxiety for the preservation of his beloved daughters, and earnestly asked the officer if he could devise any method of saving them. On his answering with great concern that he feared it would be impossible, but that their only chance would be to wait for morning, the captain lifted up his hands in silent and distressful ejaculation. At this dreadful moment the ship struck, with such violence as to dash the heads of those standing in the cuddy against the deck above them, and the shock was accompanied by a shriek of horror that burst at one instant from every quarter of the ship. Many of the seamen, who had been remarkably inattentive and remiss in their duty during a great part of the storm, now poured upon deck, where no exertions of the officers could keep them, while their assistance might have been useful. They had actually skulked in their hammocks, leaving the working of the pumps and other necessary labors to the officers of the ship and the soldiers, who had made uncommon exertions. Roused by a sense of their danger, the same seamen, at this moment in frantic exclamations, demanded of heaven and their fellow sufferers that succor which their own efforts timely made might possibly have procured. The ship continued to beat on the rocks, and soon bilging, fell with her broadside towards the shore. When she struck, a number of men climbed up the ensign's staff, under an apprehension of her immediately going to pieces. Mr. Martian, the second mate, at this crisis offered to these unhappy beings the best advice which could be given. He recommended that all should come to the side of the ship lying lowest on the rocks, and singly to take the opportunities which might then offer, of escaping to the shore. Thus having provided to the utmost of his power for the safety of the desponding crew, he returned to the round house, where, by this time, all the passengers and most of the officers had assembled. The latter were employed in offering consolation to the unfortunate ladies, and with unparalleled magnanimity, suffering their compassion for the fair and amiable companions of their misfortunes to prevail over the sense of their own danger. In this charitable work of comfort Mr. Martian now joined, by assurances of his opinion that the ship would hold together till the morning, when all would be safe. Captain Pierce, observing one of the young gentlemen loud in his exclamations of terror, and frequently cry that the ship was parting, cheerfully bid him be quiet, remarking that though the ship should go to pieces, he would not, but would be safe enough. It is difficult to convey a correct idea of the scene of this deplorable catastrophe, without describing the place where it happened. The Halswell struck on the rocks near Seacombe, on the island of Purbeck, between Perival Point and St. Albans Head, at a part of the shore where the cliff is of vast height, and rises almost perpendicular from its base. But at this particular spot the foot of the cliff is excavated into a cavern of 10 or 12 yards in depth, and of breadth equal to the length of a large ship. The sides of the cavern are so nearly upright as to be of extremely difficult access, and the bottom is strewed with sharp and uneven rocks, which seem, by some convulsion of the earth, to have been detached from its roof. The ship lay with her broadside opposite to the mouth of this cavern, with her whole length stretched almost from side to side of it. But when she struck, it was too dark for the unfortunate persons on board to discover the real magnitude of their danger, and the extreme horror of such a situation. Even Mr. Martian entertained a hope that she might keep together till daylight, and endeavored to cheer his drooping friends, and in particular the unhappy ladies, with this comfortable expectation, as an answer to the captain's inquiries what he thought of their condition. In addition to the company already in the round house, they had admitted 3 black women and 2 soldiers' wives, who, with the husband of one of them, had been allowed to come in, though the seamen, who had tumultuously demanded entrance to get the lights, had been opposed and kept out by Mr. Rogers and Mr. Brimmer, the 3rd and 5th mates. The numbers there were therefore now increased to near 50. Captain Pierce sat on a chair, a cot, or some other movable, with a daughter on each side, whom he alternately pressed to his affectionate breast. The rest of the melancholy assembly were seated on the deck, which was strewed with musical instruments and the wreck of furniture and other articles. Here also Mr. Martian, after having cut several wax candles in pieces and stuck them up in various parts of the round house, and lighted up all the glass lanthorns he could find, took his seat, intending to wait the approach of dawn, and then assist the partners of his danger to escape. But observing that the poor ladies appeared parched and exhausted, He brought a basket of oranges, and prevailed on some of them to refresh themselves by sucking a little of the juice. At this time they were all tolerably composed, except Miss Mansell, who was in hysteric fits on the floor of the deck of the round house. But on Mr. Meriton's return to the company, he perceived a considerable alteration in the appearance of the ship. The sides were visibly giving way, the deck seemed to be lifting, and he discovered other strong indications that she could not hold much longer together. On this account he attempted to go forward to look out, but immediately saw that the ship had separated in the middle, and that the forepart having changed its position, lay further towards the sea. In such an emergency, when the next moment might plunge him into eternity, he determined to seize the present opportunity, and follow the example of the crew and soldiers, who were now quitting the ship in numbers, and making their way to the shore, though quite ignorant of its nature and description. Among other expedients, the ensign's staff had been unshipped, and attempted to be laid between the ship's side and some of the rocks, but without success, for it snapped asunder before it reached them. However, by the light of a lanthorn which a seaman handed through a skylight of the round house to the deck, Mr. Meriton discovered a spar which appeared to be laid from the ship's side to the rocks, and on this spar he resolved to attempt his escape. Accordingly, lying down upon it, he thrust himself forward. However, he soon found that it had no communication with the rock. He reached the end of it, and then slipped off, receiving a very violent bruise in his fall, and before he could recover his legs he was washed off by the surge. He now supported himself by swimming, until a returning wave dashed him against the back part of the cavern. Here he laid hold of a small projection in the rock, but was so much benumbed that he was on the point of quitting it, when a seaman, who had already gained a footing, extended his hand, and assisted him until he could secure himself a little on the rock, from which he clambered on a shelf still higher, and out of the reach of the surf. Mr. Rogers, the third mate, remained with the captain, and the unfortunate ladies and their companions, nearly 20 minutes after Mr. Meriton had quitted the ship. Soon after, the latter left the round house. The captain asked what was become of him, to which Mr. Rogers replied that he was gone on deck to see what could be done. After this, a heaving sea breaking over the ship, the ladies exclaimed, "Oh, poor Meriton! He is drowned! Had he stayed with us he would have been safe," and they all, particularly Miss Mary Pierce, expressed great concern at the apprehension of his loss. On this occasion Mr. Rogers offered to go and call in Mr. Meriton, but it was opposed by the ladies, from an apprehension that he might share the same fate. The sea was now breaking in at the fore part of the ship, and reached as far as the mainmast. Captain Pierce gave Mr. Rogers a nod, and they took a lamp and went together into the stern gallery, where, after viewing the rocks for some time, Captain Pierce asked Mr. Rogers if he thought there was any possibility of saving the girls, to which he replied he feared there was none, for they could only discover the black face of the perpendicular rock, and not the cavern which afforded shelter to those who escaped. They then returned to the round house, where Mr. Rogers hung up the lamp, and Captain Pierce sat down between his two daughters, struggling to suppress the paternal tears which burst into his eyes. The sea continuing to break in very fast, Mr. McManus, the midshipman, and Mr. Schultz asked Mr. Rogers what they could do to escape. "Follow me," he replied, and they all went into the stern gallery, and from thence to the upper quarter gallery on the poop. While there, a very heavy sea fell on board, and the round house gave way. Mr. Rogers heard the ladies shriek at intervals as if the water reached them, the noise of the sea at other times drowning their voices. Mr. Brimmer had followed him to the poop, where they remained together about 5 minutes, when on the breaking of this heavy sea they jointly seized a hen coop. The same wave which proved fatal to some of those below, carried him and his companion to the rock, on which they were violently dashed and miserably bruised. Here on the rock were 27, but it now being lower water, and as they were convinced that on the flowing of the tide all must be washed off, many tried to get to the back or the sides of the cavern, beyond the reach of the returning sea. Scarcely more than 6, besides Mr. Rogers and Mr. Brimmer, succeeded. Of the others, some shared the fate which they had apprehended, and others perished in their efforts to get into the cavern. Mr. Rogers and Mr. Brimmer both reached it, however, and scrambled up the rock, on narrow shelves of which they fixed themselves. Mr. Rogers got so near his friend Mr. Meriton as to exchange mutual congratulations with him. A warm friendship indeed subsisted between these two gentlemen. They had made a long and painful voyage together in another Indiaman, where they survived an uncommon mortality by which the crew were visited. They returned to England, and an interval of only 25 days elapsed before they again embarked in the Hoswell. Mr. Rogers, on gaining this station, was so nearly exhausted, that had his exertions been protracted only a few minutes longer, he must have sunk under them. He was now prevented from joining Mr. Meriton by at least 20 men between them, none of whom could move without the imminent peril of his life. They found that a very considerable number of the crew, seamen and soldiers, and some petty officers, were in the same situation as themselves, though many who had reached the rocks below perished in attempting to ascend. They could yet discern some part of the ship, and in their dreary station solaced themselves with the hope of its remaining entire until daybreak, for in the midst of their own distress, the sufferings of the females on board affected them with the most poignant anguish, and every sea that broke inspired them with terror for their safety. But alas, their apprehensions were too soon realized. Within a very few minutes of the time that Mr. Rogers gained the rock, a universal shriek, which long vibrated in their ears, in which the voice of female distress was lamentably distinguished, announced the dreadful catastrophe. In a few moments all was hushed, except the roaring of the winds and the dashing of the waves. The wreck was buried in the deep, and not an atom of it was ever afterwards seen. The shock which this gave to the trembling wretches in the cavern was awful. Though themselves hardly rescued from the sea, and still surrounded by impending dangers, they wept for the destiny of their unhappy companions. But this was not all. Many who had gained a precarious station, weakened with injuries, benumbed and battered by the tempest, forsook their holdfasts, and, tumbling on the rocks below, perished beneath the feet of their miserable companions. Their dying groans and exclamations for pity only tended to awaken more painful apprehensions, and increase the terror of the survivors. At length, after 3 hours, which appeared so many ages, day broke, but instead of bringing relief to the sufferers, it only served to disclose the horrors of their situation. They now found, that had the country been alarmed by the guns of distress which they had continued to fire for many hours before the ship struck, but which were not heard, owing to the violence of the storm, they could neither be observed by the people from above, nor could any boat live below. They were completely overhung by the cliff, so that no ropes let down could reach them, nor did any part of the wreck remain as a guide to their retreat. The only prospect of saving themselves was to creep along the side of the cavern to its outward extremity, and on a ledge scarcely as broad as a man's hand, to turn the corner and endeavor to clamber up the precipice, almost perpendicular, and nearly 200 feet high from the bottom. And in this desperate effort some did succeed, while others, trembling with fear, and exhausted by the preceding conflict, lost their footing and perished in the attempt. The first who gained the top were the cook and James Thompson, quartermaster. The moment they reached it, they hastened to the nearest house, and made known the condition of their comrades. This was Eastington, the habitation of Mr. Garland, steward to the proprietors of the Purbeck quarries. He immediately collected the workmen, and procuring ropes with all possible dispatch, made the most humane and zealous exertions for the relief of the surviving people. Mr. Meriton made a similar attempt to that of the two others, and almost reached the edge of the precipice. A soldier who preceded him had his feet on a small projecting rock or stone, on which also Meriton had fastened his hands to aid his progress. At this critical moment the quarrymen arrived, and seeing a man so nearly within their reach, they dropped a rope to him, of which he immediately laid hold, and in a vigorous effort to avail himself of this advantage, loosened the stone on which he stood, and which supported Mr. Meriton. It giving way, Mr. Meriton must have been precipitated to the bottom, had not a rope at that instant providentially been lowered to him, which he seized, when absolutely in the act of falling, and was safely drawn to the summit. But the fate of Mr. Brimmer was peculiarly severe. Only 9 days before the ship sailed, he had been married to a beautiful young lady, the daughter of Captain Norman of the Royal Navy, in which service he was a lieutenant, and now on a visit to an uncle at Madras. After getting ashore with Mr. Rogers and up the side of the cavern, he remained until morning, when he crawled out. A rope being thrown to him, he was either so benumbed with cold as to fasten it insecurely about his body, or from some other cause or agitation, to neglect doing it completely, at the moment when about to be rescued from his perilous stand, he fell and was dashed to pieces in the presence of his companions. More assistance was obtained as the day advanced, and as the efforts of the survivors permitted, they crawled to the extremities of the cavern and presented themselves to their preservers above, who stood prepared to assist them. The means of doing so was by two men boldly approaching the very brink of the precipice, a rope being tied round them and fastened to a strong iron bar fixed in the ground. Behind them were two more, the like number further back, and so on. A strong rope, also properly secured, passed round them, by which they might hold and preserve themselves from falling. They then let down a rope, with a noose made ready, below to the cavern, and the wind blowing hard, it was in some instances forced under the projecting rock, sufficiently for the sufferers to reach it without creeping out. Whoever caught it put the noose round his body and was drawn up. The distance from the top of the rock to the cavern was at least 100 feet, and the rock projected about 8. 10 feet formed a declivity to the edge, and the rest was perpendicular. Many, however, in attempting to secure themselves, shared the fate of Mr. Brimmer, and unable, from weakness or perturbation, to benefit by the assistance offered from above, they were at last precipitated from the cliff, and were either dashed to pieces on the rocks below, or perished in the waves. Among those unhappy sufferers was one who, being washed off the rock, or falling into the sea, was carried out by the return of the waves beyond the breakers, within which his utmost efforts could never again bring him, but he was always further withdrawn by the sea. He swam remarkably well, and continued to struggle in sight of his companions until his strength being exhausted, he sunk to rise no more. It was late in the day before all the survivors gained the land. One, indeed a soldier, remained in this precarious station until the morning of Saturday the 7th of January, exposed to the utmost danger and distress. When the officers, seamen, and soldiers were mustered at the house of Mr. Garland, they were found to amount to 74, and these were the only persons saved out of rather more than 240 that were on board when the ship sailed through the Downs, including the passengers. It was supposed that about 50 of the remainder reached the rocks, but were then washed off or fell from the cliffs, and that 50 or more sunk with the captain and the ladies in the roundhouse, when the after part went to pieces. An accurate account of the whole numbers in the ship could never be attained, as the last returns dispatched from her did not arrive. The whole who reached the summit of the rock survived, excepting 2 or 3 who were supposed to have expired while drawing up, and a black who died soon afterwards, though many were severely bruised. Mr. Meriton and Mr. Rogers, having been supplied with the necessary means of making their journey by Mr. Garland, set off from London to carry the tidings of this disaster to the India House, where they arrived at noon on Sunday the 8th. On the way they acquainted the magistrates of the towns through which they passed, that a number of shipwrecked seamen would soon be on the road to the metropolis. This they did to avert any suspicions of their travelling for some other intent. It is truly deserving of communication that the master of the Crown Inn at Blandford, Dorsetshire, not only sent for all the distressed seamen to his house, where he liberally refreshed them, but presented each with a half-crown on his departure. By this unfortunate shipwreck all the passengers perished. The ladies were peculiarly endowed with beauty and accomplishments. The captain was a man of distinguished worth, humane and generous. He left, besides those 2 daughters who suffered along with him, 6 other children and a widow to deplore his loss. Most of the officers also perished. One of them, Mr. Thomas Jean, a midshipman, who was also under the immediate care of Captain Pierce, after gaining the rock was swept off by the waves. Swimming well, he again reached it, but unable to support the weakness which assailed him and the beating of the storm, he yielded his hold and perished in the sea. End of chapter 19.
Section 20 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Gould. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 20. An account of 4 Russian sailors abandoned on the island of East Spitzbergen. In the year 1743, a merchant of Meissen, in Russia, fitted out a vessel for the Greenland whale fishery. She carried 14 men and was destined for Spitzbergen. For 8 successive days after their sailing the wind was fair, but on the 9th it changed, so that instead of getting to the coast of Spitzbergen, the usual rendezvous of the Dutch ships, they were driven eastward, and after some days elapsed they found themselves near an island, called by the Russians Little Brown. Approaching within 3 versts, or 2 English miles of this island, the vessel was suddenly surrounded by ice, and the crew were reduced to an extremely dangerous situation. In this alarming state, a council was held when the mate, Alexei Nimkov, informed his comrades that some of the people of Meissen formerly intended wintering on this island, and for that purpose had carried timber hither, fit for building a hut, and actually erected one at some distance from the shore. The whole crew therefore concluded to winter there if the hut, as they hoped, still existed, because they were exposed to imminent danger by remaining in the ship, and they would infallibly perish if they did so. 4 of the crew were, on that account, dispatched in search of it or any other assistance they might meet with. The names of these 4 were Alexei Nimkov, Ivan Nimkov, Stephen Sherapov, and Fyodor Verigin. 2 miles of ice intervened between them and the shore, which, being loose and driven together by the wind, rendered their approach difficult and dangerous. Providing themselves with a musket, a powder horn containing 12 charges of powder, with as many balls, an axe, a kettle, about 20 pounds of flour, a knife, a tinder box, some tobacco, and each his wooden pipe, they soon arrived on the island. Their first employment was exploring the country, when they discovered the hut alluded to about 1.5 miles from the shore. It was 36 feet long, 18 broad, and 18 high, and consisted of 2 chambers. Rejoicing greatly at their success, they passed the night in it, though having been built a considerable time, it had suffered much from the weather. Next morning the 4 men hastened to the shore, impatient to communicate their good fortune to their comrades, likewise designing to get such stores, ammunition, and necessaries from the vessel as to enable them to winter on the island. But the reader may conceive their sorrow and astonishment when, on reaching the place where they had landed, nothing was to be seen but an open sea, instead of the ice which only the day preceding had covered it. Doubtless a violent storm which arose during the night had operated the change. It was not known, however, whether the vessel had been beat to pieces by the ice, or whether she had been carried by the current to the ocean, not an uncommon event in Greenland. Whatever accident befell her, certain it is they saw her no more, whence it is probable that she sunk, and that all on board perished. This unfortunate occurrence deprived them of the hope of ever being able to quit the island, and, full of horror and despair, they returned to the hut. But their first attention was directed to the means of providing subsistence, and repairing their habitation. The 12 charges of powder procured them as many reindeer, for the island, fortunately for them, abounded with these animals. Though there were many crevices in the building, the wood of the hut was still sound and unimpaired. Therefore the deficiency was supplied, and done the more easily, because the lower class of Russians are expert carpenters. Here they had plenty of moss to assist them. The intense cold of the climate prevents the growth of vegetables, and no species of tree or shrub is found on the islands of Spitzbergen. The Russians, however, collected a quantity of wood on the shore, which at first consisted of the wrecks of vessels, and afterwards of whole trees with their roots, the produce of some more hospitable climate, though unknown. Fortunately they found several bits of old iron, some nails 5 or 6 inches long, and an iron hook on a few wooden boards washed in by the sea. They likewise found the root of a fir tree, bent and nearly fashioned into the shape of a bow. By the help of a knife, a bow was soon formed, but wanting a string and arrows. Unable at present to procure either, they resolved to make 2 lances to defend themselves against the white bears. The iron hook was therefore fashioned into a hammer, by widening a hole which it happened to have about the middle, with one of the largest nails. A large pebble served for an anvil, and a couple of reindeer horns served for the tongs. By means of such tools 2 spearheads were made, which were tied fast with thongs to sticks about the thickness of a man's arm. Thus equipped, the Russians ventured to attack a white bear, and, after a most dangerous encounter, succeeded in killing it. This was a new supply of provisions. They relished the flesh exceedingly, and easily divided the tendons into filaments, which, besides other uses, served for strings to their bow. The Russians, in the next place, proceeded to forge some bits of iron into smaller pieces, resembling the head of spears, and these were fitted to arrows by fastening them to fir rods. Thus they had a complete bow and arrows, and were more easily enabled to obtain food. With these, during their abode on the island, they killed no less than 250 reindeer, and a great number of blue and white foxes. They fed on the flesh of these animals, and used their skins for clothing. They killed only 10 white bears during their residence, and that at the utmost hazard, for these creatures are amazingly strong, and defended themselves with surprising vigor and fury. The first was attacked intentionally. The other 9 were killed in self-defense, for the animals even ventured to enter the outer room of the hut to devour them. Some, less ferocious than others, were repulsed on the first attempt, but a repetition of their attacks exposed the sailors to the continual apprehension of being destroyed. As they could not afford wood for a constant fire, they dried a portion of their provision in the open air, and afterwards hung it up in the hut, which was always full of smoke. Prepared in this way, they used it for bread, because they were under the necessity of eating their other flesh half raw. Unfortunately, one of the Russians was attacked by the scurvy. Ivan Nemkov, who had wintered several times on the coast of West Spitzbergen, advised his companions to swallow raw and frozen meat in small pieces, to drink the blood of the reindeer, as it flowed warm from the veins of the animal, and to eat scurvy grass, although it was not very abundant. Those who followed his injunctions found an effectual antidote. But Fyodor Verigin, being naturally of an indolent disposition, averse to drinking the reindeer blood, and unwilling to leave the hut when he could possibly avoid it, was soon seized with the scurvy. Under this afflicting distemper he passed nearly 6 years, enduring the greatest sufferings. At length he became so weak that he could not sit erect, nor even raise his hand to his mouth, so that his humane companions were obliged to attend on and feed him like a newborn infant until the hour of his death. In the course of their excursions through the island, the seamen had met with a slimy loam, or kind of clay, of which they contrived to make a lamp, and proposed to keep it constantly burning with the fat of the animals they should kill. Thus they filled it with reindeer's fat, and stuck a bit of twisted linen for a wick. But, to their mortification, always as the fat melted, it not only was absorbed by the clay, but fairly run through it on all sides. On this account they formed another lamp, which they dried thoroughly in the air, and heated red hot. It was next quenched in their kettle, wherein they had boiled a quantity of flour down to the consistence of thin starch. When filled with melted fat, they found to their great joy that it did not leak. Encouraged by this attempt, they made another, that at all events they might not be destitute of light, and saved the remainder of their flour for similar purposes. Oakum thrown ashore, as also cordage found among the wrecks of vessels, served for wicks, and when these resources failed, they converted their shirts and drawers to the same purpose. By such means they kept a lamp burning from soon after their arrival on the island, until the day of their embarkation for their native country. Clothes in so rigorous a climate next became an object of necessity. The uses to which they had applied what they had brought with them exposed them still more to its severity. The skins of reindeer and foxes had hitherto served for bedding. It was essential to devise some method of tanning them, the better to withstand the weather. This was accomplished in a certain degree by soaking the skins in water until the hair could be rubbed off, and then putting reindeer fat upon them. The leather by such a process became soft and pliant. The want of awls and needles was supplied by bits of iron occasionally collected. Of them they made a kind of wire, which, being heated red hot, was pierced with a knife, ground to a sharp point, which formed the eye of a needle. The sinews of bears and reindeer, split into threads, served for sewing the pieces of leather together, which enabled the Russians to procure jackets and trousers for summer dress, and a long fur gown with a hood for their winter apparel. The wants of these unfortunate persons being thus provided for, the only reflections disturbing them were regret for those left behind at home, or the apprehensions of some one of them surviving all his companions, and then either famishing for want of food, or becoming a prey to wild beasts. The mate, Alexei Nemkov, had a wife and 3 children, who were constantly in his mind, and he was unhappy from the dread of never seeing them more. Excepting white bears, foxes, and reindeer, with which the island abounds, no other animals inhabit it. A few birds are seen in summer, such as geese, ducks, and other waterfowl. Whales seldom approach the shore, but there are great numbers of seals. Other fish are scarce, and indeed their being in plenty would little avail the Russians, who were unprovided with the means of taking them. Sometimes they found the teeth and jaws of seals on the shore, but never an entire carcass, for when these animals die on land, the white bears immediately eat them. The common food of this ferocious creature, however, is the flesh of dead whales, which are frequently seen floating about in the polar regions, and are sometimes cast on shore. When this provision fails, they fall upon seals, devouring them and other animals sleeping on the beach. The island had many mountains and steep rocks of stupendous height, perpetually covered with snow and ice. Not a tree, nor even the poorest shrub, was to be met with. Neither is there any vegetable but scurvy grass, although plenty of moss grows in every part. The Russians found no river. However, there were many small rivulets rising among the rocks and mountains, which afforded a quantity of water. They saw the sun moving for months together round the horizon during summer, and in winter they were an equal length of time in total darkness. But the aurora borealis, which was then frequent, contributed to lessen the gloominess of so long a night. Thick cloudy weather, great quantities of snow, and almost incessant rain at certain seasons, often obscured the stars. The snow totally covered the hut in winter, and left them no way of getting out of it, excepting by a hole which they had made in the roof of one of the chambers. When the unfortunate mariners had passed nearly 6 years in this dismal abode, Fyodor Verigin, who had all along been in a languid state, died, after suffering the most excruciating pains. Though his companions were thus freed of the trouble of attending on him, and the grief of witnessing his misery, they were deeply affected by his death. They saw their number lessened, and each wished to be the next to follow him. Having died in winter, a grave as deep as possible was dug in the snow to receive his corpse, and the survivors then covered it over to the best of their power to prevent the white bears from getting at it. While the melancholy reflections excited by Verigin's death were still fresh in the minds of his comrades, and while each expected to pay the like duties to the companions of his misfortunes that they had done to him, or to be himself the first to receive them, a Russian vessel unexpectedly came in view on the 15th of August, 1749. This vessel belonged to a trader who had come to Archangel, and intended to winter in Nova Zembla. But fortunately it was proposed to him to winter at West Spitzbergen, to which, after many objections, he assented. Contrary winds on the passage prevented the ship from reaching the place of her destination, and drove her toward East Spitzbergen, directly opposite to the residence of the mariners. As soon as they perceived her, they hastened to light fires on the nearest hills, and then ran to the beach, waving a flag made of a reindeer skin fastened to a pole. The people on board, observing these signals, concluded there were men ashore imploring their assistance, and therefore came to an anchor near the island. To describe the joy of the unfortunate mariners at seeing the moment of their deliverance so near is impossible. They soon agreed with the master of the vessel to take them and all their riches on board, for which they should work during the voyage, and pay him 80 roubles on arriving in Russia. Therefore they embarked, carrying with them 2,000 weight of reindeer fat, many hides of the same animals, the skins of the blue and white foxes and bears they had killed. Neither did they neglect to carry away their spears, their knife and axe, which were almost worn out, or their awls and needles, which were carefully preserved in a box very ingeniously made of bone. After spending 6 years and 3 months in this rueful solitude, they arrived safe at Archangel on the 25th of September, 1749. But the moment of landing was nearly fatal to the affectionate wife of Alexei Himkof, who happened to be present when the vessel came into port. Immediately recognizing her husband, she ran with such eagerness to embrace him that she slipped into the water, and very narrowly escaped being drowned. All the 3 survivors were strong and healthy, having lived so long without bread they could not be reconciled to the use of it. Neither could they bear spirituous liquors, and drank nothing but water. As they were vassals of Count Shuvalov, who then had a grant of the whale fishery, Monsieur Leroy requested of him that they might be sent from Archangel to St. Petersburg, where he could satisfy himself respecting their adventures. Accordingly 2 of them arrived, Alexei Himkof, aged about 50, and Ivan Himkof, about 30. They brought some curious specimens of their workmanship, so neatly executed that it was doubtful with what tools it could have been done. From their account, both to Monsieur Klingstadt, auditor of the Admiralty at Archangel, and what they now communicated, Monsieur Leroy composed the preceding narrative. For centuries past, Spitzbergen has been greatly resorted to on account of the profitable whale fishery of the surrounding seas, and several shipwrecks, as well as incidents similar to the preceding, have occurred there, and in the vicinity. Spitzbergen is a bleak and barren country, and received its name from the lofty pointed mountains by which it is covered. Perpetual snow prevails. Few plants spring from the soil, and it is destitute of wood. But to compensate in some measure for the scanty productions of nature by land, its seas, abundantly stored with fish, can afford a copious supply both of food and clothing to mankind. End of chapter 20. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 21 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 21. Loss of the Amphitrite Convict Ship. The following particulars of the loss of this vessel are copied from a letter dated Boulogne-sur-Mer, September 1st, 1833. The shocking event which is announced by the title to this letter has, I assure you, filled the town with dismay, and must lead to a most narrow and rigid investigation. I cannot attempt to describe the afflictions not only of the English, but the French, at this most distressing event, and I only express the general opinion when I say that the British public demands that an inquiry be instituted into the conduct of all parties concerned in this deplorable affair. The Amphitrite convict ship sailed for New South Wales from Woolwich on the 25th of August. Captain Hunter was the commander, Mr. Forrester the surgeon, and there were 108 female convicts, 12 children, and a crew of 16 persons. The captain was part owner of the vessel. When the ship arrived off Dungeness, the gale of the 29th began. On Friday morning the captain hove the ship to, the gale being too heavy to sail. The vessel was about 3 miles to the east from Boulogne harbour on Saturday at noon, when they made land. The captain set the topsail and main foresail in hopes of keeping her off shore. From 3 o'clock she was in sight of Boulogne, and certainly the sea was most heavy and the wind extremely strong, but no pilot boat went out to her, and no lifeboats or other assistance were dispatched. I observed her from 3 o'clock till about 4:30 in the afternoon, when she came round into Boulogne harbour and struck on the sands. By 4 o'clock it was known that it was a British ship, but some said it was a brig, others said it was a merchant vessel, though all said it was English. It appears from the statement of 3 men who have been saved out of the crew, all the rest having perished, that the captain ordered the anchor to be let go, in hopes of swinging round with the tide. In a few minutes after the vessel had gone aground, multitudes rushed to the beach, and a brave French sailor, named Pierre Henin, who has already received the thanks of the Humane Society of London, addressed himself to the captain of the port, and said that he was resolved to go alone, and to reach the vessel, in order to tell the captain that he had not a moment to lose, but must, as it was low water, send all his crew and passengers on shore. You will recollect that up to the time of her running aground no measure was adopted, and the captain was not warned from shore of her danger. As soon as she is struck, however, a pilot boat, commanded by Francois Huret, who has on many occasions shown much courage and talent, was dispatched, and by a little after 5 came under her bows. The captain of the vessel refused to avail himself of the assistance of Huret and his brave companions, and when a portion of the crew proposed going on shore, the captain prevented them. 2 of the men saved state that they knew the boat was under the bows, but that the rest were below making up their bundles. The crew could then have got on shore, and all the unfortunate women and children. When the French boat had gone, the surgeon sent for Owen, one of the crew, and ordered him to get out the longboat. This was about 5:30. The surgeon discussed the matter with his wife and with the captain. They were afraid of allowing the prisoners to go on shore. The wife of the surgeon is said to have proposed to leave the convicts there, and to go on shore without them. In consequence of this discussion, no longboat was sent out. 3 of the convict women told Owen that they heard the surgeon persuaded the captain not to accept the assistance of the French boat on account of the prisoners who were on board. Let us now return to Pierre Henin. The French pilot boat had been refused by the surgeon and captain. The longboat had been put out, through a discussion as to saving the convicts, and it was now nearly 6 o'clock. At that time Henin went to the beach, stripped himself, took a line, swam naked for about 3/4 of an hour or an hour, and arrived at the vessel at a little after 7. On reaching the right side of the vessel, he hailed the crew, and said, "Give me a line to conduct you on land, or you are lost, as the sea is coming in." He spoke English plain enough to be heard. He touched the vessel, and told them to speak to the captain. They threw, that is, some of the crew, but not the surgeon or captain, 2 lines, one from the stern and one from the bow. The one from the stern he could not seize, the one from the bow he did. He then went towards the shore, but the rope was stopped. This was, it is believed, of the act of the surgeon and captain. He, Henin, then swam back and told them to give him more rope to get on shore. The captain and surgeon would not. They then tried to haul him in, but his strength failed, and he got on shore. You perceive, then, that up to this moment also the same obstacle existed in the minds of the captain and surgeon. They did not dare, without authority, to land the convicts, and rather than leave them on board, or land them without such authority, they perished with them. The female convicts who were battened down under the hatches on the vessel's running aground broke away the half-deck hatch, and frantic rushed on deck. Of course they entreated the captain and surgeon to let them go on shore in the long boat, but they were not listened to, as the captain and surgeon did not feel authorized to liberate prisoners committed to their care. At 7 o'clock the flood tide began. The crew, seeing that there were no hopes, clung to the rigging. The poor 108 women and 12 children remained on deck, uttering the most piteous cries. The vessel was about 3/4 of a mile English from the shore, and no more. Owen, one of the 3 men saved, thinks that the women remained on deck in this state about an hour and a half. Owen and 4 others were on the spars, and thinks they remained there 3/4 of an hour, but seeing no hope of being saved, he took to swimming, and was brought in a state of insensibility to the hotel. Towsey, another of the men saved, was on a plank with the captain. Towsey asked who he was. He said, "I am the captain," but the next moment he was gone. Rice, the 3rd man, floated ashore on a ladder. He was in the aft when the other men took to the raft. When the French pilot boat rowed away, after being rejected by the captain, He, Rice, saw a man waving his hat on the beach, and remarked to the captain that a gentleman was waving to them to come on shore. The captain turned away and made no answer. At that moment the women all disappeared. The ship broke in two. These are the facts of this awful case. The French Marine Humane Society immediately placed hundreds of men on the beach, and the office or lodging being close to the shore, as soon as the corpses were picked up they were brought to the rooms, where I assisted many of my countrymen in endeavoring to restore them to life. Our efforts were fruitless except in the cases of the three men, Owen, Rice, and Towsey. I never saw so many fine and beautiful bodies in my life. Some of the women were the most perfectly made, and English and French wept together at such a horrible loss of life in sight of A, and even close to the port and town. Body after body has been brought in. More than 60 have been found. They will be buried to-morrow. But alas, after all our efforts, only 3 lives have been saved out of 136. End of chapter 21.